Erik Trump is professor of political science at Saginaw Valley State, where he teaches art and politics, American political thought, American popular culture. With Jesse Donahue, he has written 3 books about American zoos, the most recent of which examined zoos during the Depression. Erik Trump.
Thank you very much. I tried to find some pictures taken 100 years from now, but was unsuccessful, so I don't have a PowerPoint to go with this lecture. In 1932, Robert Moses took the reins of the New York City Parks Department. Within a decade, he had added several new zoos, each, for its time, a gem. He also added scores of new playgrounds, swimming pools, and small parks, greatly increasing the availability of recreational facilities. By the 1960s, he'd slashed through borough politics, built a web of freeways, and created the modern city we know. In the process, he paved over and destroyed irreplaceable natural habitats. His vision of giving citizens equal access to the city's resources was democratic, his methods autocratic. In his arrogance, intelligence, power, and effectiveness, he made Donald Trump look like a rejected apprentice. My predictions take their inspiration, for better or for worse, from Moses, who had little patience for the established way of doing things, but great interest in public recreation and the happiness of citizens. I contend that over the next 100 years, the zoo will expand its socio-cultural roles, becoming a more human-centered institution in the process. It will be somewhat less arc and more museum. It will be somewhat less explicitly educational and more recreational. It will become less conservation cheerleader and more conservation practitioner. It will be less global and more local. Eventually, it will be less zoo and more wildlife park service, less Noah and more Moses. My predictions come with a few caveats. By zoo, I refer to highly professional, comparatively funded, and mostly North American urban institutions. Diversity will prevail, so I'm not disagreeing with what other people have said here, and institutional inertia will keep many zoos from adopting the changes I outline. In fact, even my future has 3, maybe 4 distinct paths. I begin with 5 assumptions about the forces that will affect zoos' mission. First, I offer the perhaps ungenerous assumption that people go to the zoo for recreation, not education. I've seen the Shedd Aquarium's dolphin show at least 4 times, and although I recall nothing about the educational gloss that supposedly justifies it, I have very vivid and pleasant memories of dolphins walking on their tails, which I think must be a false memory, but there it is. Second, we live in a consumer society, and zoos will continue to be market-driven, providing patrons with the consumption experiences they desire. As Aldo Leopold cogently observed, zoogoers still see nature less as a community to be conserved than as a commodity to be consumed. But admitting that we have a consumer culture need not imply that a conservation ethos cannot be consumed. I expect that people will turn a green ethos into a status symbol, much as the localvore movement has done with organic food. To satisfy a social desire for conspicuous green consumption, the zoo will provide a broader range of consumption options, especially in the areas of culture and recreation. My third assumption is that the power of nostalgia will give zoos good reasons to tap into their own pasts. Major technological innovations are often cloaked in reassuring nostalgia, and entire industries have revived consumer interest with nods to their past. Of particular relevance to zoos, historical periods of rapid change have been accompanied by a romanticism of the natural past in which man and animal lived in closer proximity. As the world shrinks digitally, the climate changes, and the third world modernizes, this pattern will emerge strongly again. This is good news for zoos, which are well positioned to satisfy our nostalgic longings for connections with animals and nature. Fourth, economic and political pressures will require zoos to attract new demographic sectors and elevate their cultural status. Despite massive efforts to use science to enhance its reputation, the modern zoo still seems very closely associated with children. Children want to see animals, parents want to see their children seeing animals, and senior citizens appear to enjoy all 3. But adults, much beyond the stroller stage, don't have real good reasons to see animals, and they need other reasons to return regularly. Those reasons have to do with status, and status derives in part from cultural sophistication. And I would say that the late 19th century zoos, if you look at photos, attracted many adults because there was status in going to the zoo at that time. In order to win financial and political support from the status conscious, the future zoo will need to present itself as a cultural institution that just happens to also have live animals. Finally, environmental and economic factors will foster the redevelopment of American cities, providing significant opportunities for zoos to expand. Larger and more concentrated urban populations will mean more citizens looking for leisure time activities in the wild. Moreover, because America's urban infrastructure is outdated, and because global warming and fossil fuel costs will require new energy efficiencies, the future city will be, to a large extent, completely new. The deconstruction and rebuilding of existing urban environments will create an opening for entirely new kinds of zoo-like institutions. New regional governments will encourage consolidations and collaborations of existing public services. By escaping their current geographic and institutional restraints, the future zoo will reassert itself as central to the urban dwellers' happiness. So, in response to these forces just described, I predict the future zoo will transform its mission in several socio-cultural ways. First, I propose that the current education mission will evolve beyond conservation and the animal sciences to focus equal attention on humans and their relationships with animals. I call this stage, which is already underway at some zoos, from ark to museum. Next, I foresee the adoption of a culture mission that will support a wide range of visual and performing arts, many not traditionally associated with the zoo. Fulfillment of this mission will elevate the zoo's status and attract new kinds of patrons. Finally, I imagine the radical reassumption of a green recreation mission that will take the form of dramatic physical transformations resulting in the first truly future zoos. So, in the first phase, within the next 50 years, zoos will extend their mission to the interpretation of humans' relationship with nature and animals. Self-reflective, self-critical, and historical, this mission will involve a curatorial shift from live animals to inanimate objects. It will highlight the good, the bad, and the ugly in how humans have treated animals. Permanent exhibitions will be replaced with rotating ones. Partnerships with other zoos and other kinds of cultural institutions will be common. The phase will generate cost efficiencies, controversies, frequent change, and new audiences. Specifically, it will take several forms. Exhibitions will highlight the colorful historical dimensions of zoos, both attractive and disturbing. Patrons will discover the lives of charismatic mega zoo directors, participate in an antiques roadshow of zoo memorabilia, marvel at dynamic and interactive displays of animal capture methods, express moral outrage at recreations of inhumane cages. The animal show will live again, represented in three-dimensional video with stages, costumes, and props displayed for our consideration. Nostalgia, education, and recreation will seamlessly combine. The Heads and Horns Gallery will return. A 20th century whaling ship will appear somewhere, surely with a Sea Shepherd conservation vessel alongside. Ecosystem preservation will be touted, thanks to a partnership with Ducks Unlimited. Who knew? Hunters love the wild too. Conservation mission will find new life in national traveling exhibitions that emphasize the zoos, some of which will emphasize the zoo's conservation activities, some of which will look outside of zoo history. Due to cost-sharing efficiencies, these exhibitions will be larger and more sophisticated than those that any single zoo could mount. Moreover, they'll generate national publicity and reviews. The mission will also foster partnerships with universities, archival libraries, and natural history museums. This first phase should accelerate rapidly since an enormous and relatively untapped supply of images, artifacts, and documents exists. Best of all, no other institution has made a prior claim on this mission. In the second phase, perhaps parallel phase, zoos should adopt a culture mission to attract an elite adult audience and allow the presentation of more explicit political messages about the environment. Zoos already contain much interesting art and architecture, and they self-consciously utilize the performing arts to varying degrees. Few, however, present culture as a primary mission, and they should. The first cave paintings were of wild animals, and the human fascination with such artistic representations has hardly dissipated. How we represent animals says a lot about us, and the zoo should help us explore the subtle and often contradictory messages embedded in those representations. Zoos should go beyond animals, however, and encourage all kinds of cultural activities that could make after-hours use of unused facilities and parking lots. This would take several actions. First, gallery space must be dedicated to the permanent and rotating exhibitions of animal and wildlife-themed visual arts. Opportunity here is enormous because the mainstream art museum world, despite the popularity of animal-themed art, exhibits very little of it. In addition, the zoo must experiment with hosting a broader range of performance arts, including theater, dance, and music. For these activities to meet the new culture mission, they will need to be much more elitist and much more entertaining than at present. Edgy, politically charged, and visually stunning performances should take precedence over preachy, feel-good conservation skits. Collaborations with arts organizations could produce new and unusual performances that interpret nature in ways we could hardly imagine from within the zoo. Culture mission would allow zoos to host provocative political messages without having to directly endorse them. Environmentalism is a political ideology, but no zoo can clearly communicate that fact under the constraints of its current mission. Art, however, may speak more freely, point fingers, and puncture complacency. To be sure, a culture mission will embroil the zoo in controversy, but a comparative scan of other institutions suggests that plenty of vocal and powerful defenders will rise in its support. If a zoo takes its history and culture mission seriously, the final step will be architectural distinction. The Bilbao of the zoo world will arrive with evocative, mind-blowing architecture and materials that will attract international attention. Cultural critics will take the zoo seriously. It will appear in the arts section of the New York Times, just as circuses have begun to do. The zoo will become an indispensable public space, not just a place to take the kids. Finally, I turn to the most radical transformation, a return to the recreational routes that will prompt the development of entirely new kinds of zoos. To date, basic zoo design has changed little. We still walk, ride around, and through exhibits that are laid out in a rational, horizontal landscape. Most zoos are just variations on the same basic map. The wild, of course, resists such mapping. Nature is exciting precisely because it's not rational. It requires active investigation by the human visitor who hopes to discover animals. Zoos, no matter how prominently they use the word wild, have so far provided few recreational opportunities for true discovery. The future zoo, however, will meet this recreational promise by derationalizing design to make the visitor's experience less predictable and more obviously fun. Our mental picture of the future zoo will be more akin to the architecture of the internet than to a roadmap. I foresee this recreation mission being met through two distinct forms. First, a multi-story zoo-like museum that combines live animals with art, history, and play. Second, a decentralized, disconnected, sprawling urban zoo with high-rise wildlife refuges that provides free relaxation for city dwellers, homes for rescued animals, and educational facilities for students. Form 1. Brand new, centrally located, multi-story urban zoos will reimagine the institution as a multifaceted cultural experience with an emphasis on rotating exhibitions and free-form visitor activities along the lines of St. Louis's City Museum. And if there's anyone on the panel who's not seen St. Louis's City Museum, you have to see this museum. Designed in 1997 by artist Bob Casserly, the highly tactile and interactive City Museum repurposes a multi-story shoe factory to create a nearly indescribable experience. The visitor follows no set path, finds no interpretive glosses, and confronts a nearly overwhelming amount of visual and tactile stimuli. One can navigate multiple stories through a warren of open ducts and crawl spaces. You can take in a live acrobatic performance, descend a 7-story slide, explore a cave system, peruse books in a beat poet cafe, swim with the sharks, make sophisticated paper snowflakes, etc., etc. The experience is open-ended and transformative, unlike the experience of any amusement park, museum, or zoo I've ever visited. Within 50 years, someone will create a zoo-like version of the City Museum in a repurposed downtown building. This zoo will cater to children of all ages. Like Wilderness, it will come with no map or guide. It will favor smaller, jewel-like aquariums and exhibits of reptiles, birds, rodents, and small mammals, live and dead. It will replace geographic arrangements with more naturally human organizational schemes. The Blue Room, the Hard-to-See Room, the Prickly Animals Room, the Animals That Have Been Warren Hall. Children will be able to enter and exit old-style, inhumane cages and have their pictures taken by their parents. Thousands of old animal-themed photographs, images, sculptures will line the walls. In the Animal Torture Room, chains, restraints, cages, and veterinary tools will evoke the medieval horrors of the 20th century. Life-size animal sculptures will fill a gallery of touchable art. In the Monkey Wrenching Room, kids will test their skill at flinging stink bombs at a Japanese whaling vessel. The Crypt will house memorials to dead zoo animals. In the Gorilla Man Room, one will slip into a high-tech robot exoskeleton that will give the wearer the strength of a 500-pound gorilla. The result will be an urban wilderness, a high, low-tech, mapless place in which the modern explorer can return again and again and again to make new discoveries. In the second form that I imagine, 100 years from now, a kinder, greener Moses will emerge to coordinate the rewilding of an urban environment. This zoo director will oversee a public agency, not a single space. This agency will coordinate scores of smaller efforts to maintain recreational and educational access to the wild. Zoo experts will manage wildlife reintroductions, habitat restorations, rescue centers, and research labs spread throughout the city. Animal populations will be cared for in an extensive network of high-rise, balcony, and rooftop environments that will also cool and green the future city. In the relative quiet of a solar-powered, flourishing downtown, pedestrians will encounter a decentralized zoo, a window aquarium here, a monkey island there, an aviary behind the park benches. Rehabilitation centers, exhibits, learning labs will be distributed throughout the urban school system. Zoos have always catered to foot traffic. They're still sold as oases in an urban environment. Logically then, the future zoo will relocate directly into the urban environment, merging with parks, green spaces, and other public areas. In short, the future zoo of the next century will be like the internet, accessible from anywhere. Thank you.